everybody. All right, so welcome to Beats and Blackness, a conversation with Amor Kohli and Francesca Royster. This event is co-organized by the Center for Black Diaspora and the Women's Center at DePaul University. I am Julie Moody Freeman, the director for the Center for Black Diaspora, and I'm so happy to have Amor and Francesca with us this evening. Can't wait for this conversation. I'm thankful also to all of you who have taken time out this evening to be with us. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge a few people without whom this event could never have been possible. I'd like to thank Assistant Director for the Center for Black Diaspora, Jennifer Gardner, and then from the Women's Center, Keisha Lozano, Rena Shenoy, and Anna Mulk. I'll turn you over now to Dr. Ann Russo, professor in the Department of Women's and Gender Studies and the director of the Women's Center, who will do the introduction for the night. Ann?
Greetings, everyone, and thank you so much, Julie. The Women's Center, well, really myself and the Women's Center always love collaborating with Dr. Julie Moody Freeman and the Center for Black Diaspora. So thank you so much and welcome everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Amor and Francesca. So Amor Kohli is an associate professor in the Department of African and Black Diaspora Studies. During the academic year 2022-23, he is away from departmental chairing duties in order to serve as a DePaul Presidential Fellow. He received his PhD at Tufts University and taught at Tufts, Middlebury College, and the University of Vermont before joining us at DePaul in 2003. Kohli's publications include scholarly essays on Black writers published in the journals Callaloo, Melis, African Identities, and the Journal of Commonwealth Literature. His work has also appeared in a number of edited collections, including Beat Drama, Playwrights and Performances of the Howl Generation, The Black Imagination, Science Fiction and the Speculative, and Reconstructing the Beats, as well as an upcoming essay in the Cambridge Companion to Jazz and American Culture. In addition to editing the book we're going to hear about this evening, A Beat Beyond, Selected Prose of Major Jackson, Amor Kohli also co-edited Uprooting Urban America, Multidisciplinary Perspectives on Race, Class, and Gentrification. So welcome, Amor. And Francesca T. Royster is a professor of English at DePaul University, where she teaches courses in Shakespeare Studies, Performance Studies, Critical Race Theory, Gender and Queer Theory, and African American Literature. She received her PhD in English from the University of California, Berkeley in 1995. She is the author of Becoming Cleopatra, The Shifting Image of an Icon, as well as the author of Sounding Like a No-No, Queer Sounds and Outrageous Acts in the Post-Soul Era, which won honorable mention in the Modern Language Association's William Sanders Scarborough Prize for an outstanding scholarly study of African American literature and culture. She's also published numerous book chapters and scholarly essays in Biography, the Journal of Popular Music Studies, Shakespeare Quarterly, Shakespeare Studies, Text and Performance Studies, Performance Research International, and Women in Performance, among others. Her latest book that we're going to hear about this evening is titled Black Country Music, Listening for Revolutions, which is available today, and a forthcoming book, Choosing Family, a memoir of queer motherhood and Black resistance, that also is now currently out and an official launch, I think, on February 7th. So I'm going to turn it over to Amor first, but I just want to say that as questions arise or at any point during the conversation or after, feel free to put the questions into the chat, and the chat really goes to the hosts, and then we'll deliver your questions. Okay, so welcome, Amor. I'm going to turn it over to you first.
Great, thanks so much. And good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you to the conveners of this event, the Center for Black Diaspora and the Women's Center. Thanks also to Jennifer Gardner, Assistant Director for the Center for Black Diaspora and former ABD student, for logistics help and all of the communications to just get us settled. I'm going to start by reading a couple of excerpts from this book that I edited. A Beat Beyond, Selected Prose of Major Jackson, available for purchase wherever fine books are sold. These readings are going to be meant to give you all a sense of Jackson's voice and approach, as well as, of course, my own. The book is published by the University of Michigan Press in its Poets on Poetry series, which has published prose written by well-regarded poets since 1978. And as the name of the series implies, it mostly focuses on what poets have written about poetry, but over the years has, of course, included other topics as well, though they all seem to come back to poetry or artistry. And Major Jackson, for those who don't know, is a Black poet originally from Philadelphia who has released 5 books of poetry to date. The 6th is due sometime this year, and now 1 book of prose. He is professor and director of creative writing at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. And I think Nashville might come up again, right, Francesca? Okay, so let me start by reading some excerpts from my introduction. In the essay, My Lyrical Self, Jackson recounts an established poet's high praise after hearing an unfamiliar poet read. The established poet marvels that the newer poet, quote, is at the center of language. He is at the center of the song, end quote. Jackson writes of this state with reverence and a touch of longing. For Jackson, to be at the center of language is to be at the center of the human, to celebrate entrance and engagement with the omnifarious modalities of being and experience. That same poetic critical intelligence that created poems immersed in a mindfully observant passage through the world of human experience, linguistic, sensory, spiritual, physical, continues to work within the framework of all of the prose collected in A Beat Beyond. Jackson's extensive ars poetica paints an intimate world of interiority and personal experience. Though it might be cast as a shared experience, it diminishes the work's objectives to consider this an expression of universality. Shared but not imposed, Jackson presents his sensibility as entirely his own, divided as it might be at times, while seeking to convey this sensibility as one that might offer joy, vision, a model, or even simply a moment of connection for the reader. Honoring this poetic function is apparent in Jackson's poetry and throughout the prose collected here. While one might discern numerous fruitful paths into Jackson's artistic vision, I am particularly drawn to the work's intuitive sense that Black poetic innovation is of a piece with the innovations of the Black musical tradition. While there are certainly references to music and musicians throughout his poetry and prose, Jackson's work takes us well into invocation, carrying the lessons of the music into effect. While Jackson's work is not limited to Black music for inspiration, the formative lessons of the Black musical tradition are evident throughout the work. The ethics of community, however vexed, are guiding principles, but the imaginative empathy built into the very structures of Black music resonates across Jackson's 5 books of poetry to date, as well as the essays in this book. Moreover, a constituent element of the Black musical tradition is its integrative propensity. This has long been a hallmark of Jackson's poetic inquiry, reflecting what James Baldwin once movingly wrote about as communion, an idea that Jackson has taken up as both method and goal. Black artistry, which has always chafed against proscription and prescription, is explicitly and implicitly celebrated here, despite the efforts of those who deploy it in proscriptive ways. An integrative ethos is central to the unfolding of the Black musical tradition, and Jackson, similarly, does not merely collect or catalog influences, sensations, ideas, conversations, and musings, but communes with and amongst them. Like many of his contemporaries, Jackson takes the tack that the worlds of experience, reading, tradition, taste, or even just the world is all open for them to mine. This was, incidentally, also a point of view of the poet County Cullen, the subject of one of the essays included in this volume. Whether it was his beloved Keats or his distaste for the use of jazz in poetry, a sentiment not shared by Jackson, Cullen insisted that all traditions were open to him to use or not as he saw fit. Similarly, Jackson's critical ecumenicalism pushes him past any prescriptions of influence, taking him closer to the passage taken by Langston Hughes, County Cullen, and countless other artists to, as Hughes says in an essay, quote, stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. To be oneself at the top of the mountain, or better, at the center of song, is a guiding principle of Jackson's work that concurrently espouses a communal imperative to bring others in, or at the very least, to extend it as offering to others. A beat beyond inhabits that same spirit. So now I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts from some of Major Jackson's essays in this book. And the first one I'm going to read from is called My Lyrical Self, and I referenced it early in the introduction that you just heard. In his Nobel lecture on December 12, 1975, the Italian poet Eugenio Montal announced that, quote, the true material of poetry is sound, end quote. I doubt if Montale ever read the American poet Amiri Baraka, but nonetheless, his words echo for me Baraka's contribution to Donald Allen's landmark anthology, The New American Poetry, 1945 to 1960, in which Baraka argues, the only recognizable tradition a poet need follow is himself. And with that, say all those things out of tradition he can use, adapt, work over into something for himself. To broaden his own voice with, you have to start and finish there. Your own voice, how you sound. Baraka refutes T.S. Eliot's near neurotic urging in Tradition and the Individual Talent that poets, in their quest to become great poets, give up that which is unique and central to poetry, at least for the moment, the impression of the human soul and will. Eliot famously remarks in one of those koan-like statements that has come to define a whole approach to writing that on the surface feels spiritually driven, the progress of an artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extension of personality. Once I heard a distinguished poet remark about a poet unfamiliar to him, whom he had just met and heard give a reading from his work for the first time. It happened on a beautiful spring afternoon. With immense wonder, he said, my God, that man is at the center of language. He is at the center of song. The elder poet did not make it clear what he meant by the song or what it meant for a poet to be at the center of language. But those of us sitting in the hotel lounge awaiting the dinner hour instinctively knew. And we also knew that this was the highest praise one poet could grant another. We understood that to enter language was the equivalent of Elizabeth Catlett entering wood-carved sculptures, or Thelonious Monk entering silence at the piano and in life. A kind of mastery and contribution that is at once part of and distinct from whatever came beforehand. The poet is the historian and keeper of his art, but he's also the iconoclast who challenges and reshapes its capacity to represent human experience from the inside out. What the elder poet was praising was the younger poet's freedom and ability to slip the constraints of poetry. To write from the center of language also gets at, more succinctly, Eliot's urging to hear the song, which is the accumulated noise that is hammered into artful speech. All those poems, epic stories, sermons, myths, and other works of art that construct the comprehensive portrait of humankind. Our aim as writers is not to only hear the past, but to contribute to that song by activating and regenerating language that is reflective of our freedom. All the poems ever written are attempts to add one's own sound to that collective cry of humanity. In the poem I Too, Langston Hughes, for example, revives Walt Whitman's assertion in I Hear America Singing that each citizen's own singing what belongs to him or her and none else is a sacred component of a democratic nation. Hughes reminds readers that Black people are denied inclusion at the Freedom Banquet and that we as a country do not fulfill the promise of ideals of valuing each individual. Hughes states, I am the darker brother. I too am America. In short, I am less interested in uttering something profound or lasting, but merely want to announce my freedom, presence. It has been my experience that one's melodic self is amplified in the face of formal constraints. For poets, such decisions as writing in form or rhyme or constructing some syllabic count to which each line adheres paradoxically get us closer to a unique voice, a sound forged out of a pressurized moment, such that what lingers in the instant and mark of a selfhood in time. Think of a trumpeter or percussionist soloing against the constraints of a tune whose melody is known. Still, she must somehow inscribe her own version and interpretation. Simply listen when you have free time to Ella Fitzgerald's Moonlight in Vermont and then compare it to Willie Nelson's version. In both instances, what you hear is how style is a glorious statement of freedom against constraints. So that's from my lyrical self. And now, in the couple of minutes I have left, I'll read from another piece called Convergences and Confluences. 1. Seems like poetry was always with me, yet how difficult it is to pinpoint exactly what convergences and confluences have shaped me into becoming a poet. More a series of vague memories that intensify to one reality. From my earliest years, I have held a deep love for language, the physical properties of words in the mouth, first heard in the home. Black Tennessean folk up north, suddenly urban, signifying on conditions and each other, making sense and alluding to more than what was officially seen and heard, like the Holy Spirit in the head. Words uttered and possessed, earthbound and heavenbound too, hard and soft skins, church hats and ways of seeing. 2. Langston Hughes, Robert Frost, Selecteds and Collecteds, North Philadelphia. Grandparents' 3-floor tenement with stacks of secondhand books crowding the second-floor hallway. So many altars. Temple University, Sonia Sanchez, African American literature. Robert Hayden, Yusef Komunaka, Toni Morrison, Gwendolyn Brooks, Derek Walcott, Amiri Leroy Baraka Jones. Introduction to Poetry, Garrett Hongo, Philip Levine, Advanced Poetry, Robert Lowell, The Black Scholar, Journal of Black Poetry, Negro Digest, The Black Poets, Drama of Nomo, Broad Street Line, Hoods, Russian Hats and Khazal Eyewear, Hip Hop, Ways of Seeing, Darkroom Collecteds. 3. I relish the alterable space of a sentence along with words' inherent satellite meanings, shaped and hammered to rhythms in my head. Their force and propulsion feel like lifelines shared with friends. Many poets show the way, and what we pray for is a passage into the living, song, prayer, coveted conversations. 4. I wish to make a sound that echoes in the end that says Major Jackson. No more, no less. Thanks. That was a couple of excerpts from Major Jackson's essays and for my introduction, and I will pass it back to the host. Thank you.
Okay, that's cool. Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here. That was beautiful, Amor, and I appreciated hearing the framing and essays and poems by Major Jackson as well. And looking forward to talking more about it. Thank you so much to the Center for Black Diaspora, to the Women's Center, Annie and Julie and Jennifer and everyone who helped make this happen. Also, so excited to do this with Amor because I love talking about both writing and music with Amor and have like over the years, 20 years, if you can believe that. I've been here even longer. So, okay, so today I'm going to be talking about my book, Black Country Music, and I can talk more about how I started working on it at another time, but it's a book that is looking at like histories of Black and African-American contributions to country music and the erasure of the Black presence in country music as an ongoing issue that can go like has its roots back in Blackface minstrelsy and even further. But then it kind of zeroes in on artists who I feel are innovative in terms of using that kind of hostile, intense musical environment and creating original, exciting work. So I talk about Tina Turner, Darius Rucker, Beyonce, Valerie June, Lil Nas X, Mickey Guyton, Rissy Palmer, Delilah Black, and the group, kind of a banjo supergroup called Our Native Daughters. And they're going to be the focus of what I'll share today. And I'm going to give a little PowerPoint, if everything is working for me to go with this, but I'm just going to read a bit and then we'll be in conversation. So hopefully all the sound, does that look okay, everybody? Yeah, okay.
Yes, yep.
All right, and now I will read. So this chapter is called Can the Black Banjo Speak? Notes on Songs of Our Native Daughters. Let's see, smaller. There you go. Okay. Songs of Our Native Daughters, an album project first initiated by the multi-instrumentalist Rhiannon Giddens in 2018, together with Smithsonian Folkways, and including Amethyst Kia, Layla McCullough, and Allison Russell, is an example of taking back the tools. The album amplifies the banjo as a past and contemporary medium of Black women's expression, protest, and healing. To use the banjo as a central tool for an album that centers on Black women is risky, precisely because of the ways that Black people have been written out of its history. As Rhiannon Giddens told her audience in her 2017 keynote address to the International Bluegrass Music Association, to understand how the banjo, which was once the ultimate symbol of African-American musical expression, has done a 180 in popular understanding and become the emblem of the mythical white mountaineer. Even now, in the age of Mumford & Sons and Bella Fleck in Africa and Taj Mahal's colored aristocracy, the average person on the street sees a banjo and still thinks Deliverance or the Beverly Hillbillies. In order to understand the history of the banjo and the history of bluegrass music, we need to move beyond the narratives we've inherited, beyond generalizations that bluegrass is mostly derived from a Scots-Irish tradition with quote unquote influences from Africa. It is actually a complex Creole music that comes from multiple cultures, African and European and Native, the full truth that is so much more interesting and American. As Giddens explains in her liner notes for Notes of Our Native Daughter, the banjo, the instrument first of West African griots, traveling poets, musicians, and storytellers, and then just regular folk, was to become a Creole medium of expression and song for the multiple ethnicities of enslaved peoples coming from Africa, first to the Caribbean and then on to the United States. As the librarian and scholar Dina Epstein documents in her game-changing book, Sinful Tunes and Spirituals, Black Folk Music to the Civil War, the banjo traveled with enslaved Black people on ships during the Middle Passage. Sometimes captives were forced to exercise with their own instruments on board, in order to keep themselves alive and to battle deep depression at the horror of their conditions. Banjos were incorporated into everyday life for enslaved Black people in the United States and the Caribbean at times of rest and socializing, as well as work. For its first 100 years in the United States, the banjo was seen by white commentators as primarily an instrument of Black people, until it became a centerpiece of American popular culture through blackface minstrelsy. Sorry, guys. Blackface minstrelsy, a parody of Black life performed by white working class men. Minstrel shows were a way for white men, especially white immigrants, to perform and establish their white identity through what the historian Eric Lott calls the love and theft of Black musical traditions. With the increasing commercial success of blackface minstrelsy, a separation eventually developed and led to the eventual erasure of the banjo's connection to actual Black people in the popular imagination. Or at least whites no longer had to prove that they had learned their banjo skills from Black people. Songs of Our Native Daughters uses the banjo in new ways, but is very aware of this history. The music of Songs of Our Native Daughters reminds us that we can't understand the past through archives and texts alone. We need music to help us tap into the imaginations of those lost to us. We need music to process the heaviness and pain of the realities of Black enslaved and apartheid life. And what better music than that which was with us from the beginnings in this country and which have been lost to us for so long. Songs of Our Native Daughters offers the stories that have been erased together with old and new musical sounds and technique. The Black banjo can provide both a lens and a balm. We can call the ones who came before us with music and joy. In the summer of 2019, when I heard that Giddens and Our Native Daughters was going to play at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, DC, I quickly bought tickets for my small family, my partner Annie, our college-aged niece Demetria, who was living with us that summer, and our daughter Cece, who was then 7. We planned a road trip that would also be a research trip, weaving from Chicago to Cedar Point, Iowa, to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then to Washington, DC, catching up with family and old haunts along the way. In Rhiannon Giddens' liner notes for Songs of Our Native Daughters, she writes that one of her inspirations for taking up the project was a trip to the Smithsonian with her daughter, Aoife, who is also 7 at the time. I had been listening to Songs of Our Native Daughters nonstop that summer and playing it for anyone who would listen. And that same summer, I began the journey to learn to play the banjo myself, swallowing my pride and Black girl awkwardness every week to eke out a slow, painful version of Cripple Creek and other tunes, invoking my own small gesture at Black banjo restoration. The lessons were helping me to hear and feel the banjo differently, to recognize the interwoven layers, the percussive power of the claw hammer, the funk that could be captured if you were skillful enough, which admittedly I was not. My thoughtful teachers at the Old Town School of Folk Music here in Chicago, Chris and Dan, have led me to new discoveries of Black banjo musicians, including Sana Ndai and other Senegalese players of the akonting, one of the banjo's African cousins, the extraordinary Jaron Blind Boy Paxton, Jake Blount, Taj Mahal, and the Reverend Gary Davis. Later, with lessons from Suli Greg Wilson, multi-instrumentalist, performer, and teacher, I've been absorbing firsthand the important lessons of apprenticeship in the Black banjo tradition as a way of tapping into the instrument's inherent funkiness. Even through the distance of Zoom meetings from Arizona to Chicago in the months of the COVID pandemic, the funk of this music comes through in Suli's playing and in his teasing laughter. I wanted to join my story to the stories of struggle highlighted in Songs of Our Native Daughters. I'd begun through memoir the work of bringing together my writerly self with my everyday self as a Black queer mother, adopting and raising a Black girl child with my white partner in Chicago, the city I once swore, shivering on a bus stop as a teenager, that I would move away from to somewhere warm and never return. navigating the racism and classism and other tensions of our gentrifying neighborhood, and then recognizing that I might be a gentrifier too, even when I felt nervous walking past the police station around the corner, and making community as a way of coping with all of these complexities. Annie and I had been planning a trip to Washington, D.C. since the National Museum of African American History and Culture first opened in 2003. But we had been haunted by the legendary long lines and also by the intensity of the content, especially now that we had Cece. As we prepared for the trip that summer, my father warned us to steer Cece away from the museum's exhibit of Emmett Till's casket. At the age of 12, my father and his all-Black Boy Scout troop had been forced to attend Till's open casket funeral in Chicago, and it remains one of his most vivid memories of racial trauma. Cece had already been learning about slavery in her classroom and at the annual Black History Month assemblies at her school. More significantly, she had experienced her own body as raced as a Black girl in her mostly white school. In her very first week of kindergarten, she had been bullied on the playground by an older white boy, a fifth grader, who told her and her best friend Maya, also Black, that Black girls are nasty. Cece had gone through a period of shame about her own dark skin, a few shades darker than mine, and Annie and I worked hard to nurture in her a sense of pride and beauty. We wanted Cece's education about our nation's racist history to be as thoughtful and accurate and gentle as we could manage. So after a whole day in the museum, watching, as I said, the intense displays on the history from the Middle Passage all the way to the present, we got ready for the concert to start. At last, it was time for the concert to begin. As the lights lowered, the members of Our Native Daughters appeared on stage, each carrying a banjo like a weapon. All four women were wearing matching jeans jackets with a colorful design of four Black silhouettes, a banjo, and the letters OND. We're a girl gang now, Giddens shouts to our cheers. Giddens describes how powerful it was to wear the jackets as they toured the museum earlier that day, making them feel bolder. We reveled in their style, each with their own take on beauty. Giddens with loose silk purple tunic and bare feet, hair streaked purple and in a ponytail. Russell in a bright flower patterned halter dress. Makala laid back in a green and white kente cloth summer frock. Kia in black pantsuit with suspenders and pork pie hat. The warm red and orange stage lights brought out the varying browns of everyone's skin and gave the audience our own dose of melanin. Each took turns telling stories, teaming up with one another on the songs they had co-written. Their pleasure in playing together was evident in their appreciative gazes, in their inside jokes and flirtation, and in their shared seriousness as they listened to one another play. As the band launched into Moon Meets the Sun, I got what I had been waiting for all day at the museum. I yearned to know what was happening inside to the enslaved men and women. How did they survive? The song offers their story and their resilient spirit. First, Giddens names the damage. You steal our children, but we're dancing. You make us hate our very skin, but we're dancing. Russell deflects the shame, leaving judgment up to God, while Kia embraces the stealth of the rabbit and the spider. The smallest will still prevail. With each chorus, those lines, but we're dancing, answers the lament, backed by the bottom of that minstrel banjo, resilience. We can feel it in their own dancing as they sing to us, grounded like Giddens' bare feet. They invite us into the circle to step into the ring. The women's voices give testimony to resistance, to the separation and erasure of home, to the lessons of self-hate. Music and dancing keep us going, connect us to others, they remind us. This is the recipe for survival. With each song offering a new call and response, a new chance to unburden ourselves with song, I could feel the crowd around me releasing its tension. The concert came to a close with the song You Are Not Alone, a lullaby by Allison Russell, written, she tells the audience, for the young daughters that the women left behind to go on tour, and perhaps for her own younger self. and it was a lullaby for us. With Russell's voice, tender then swelling with feeling, the rhythms rising and falling in a waltz. The song is itself a circle.
You're the North Star and the compass, always finding something wondrous. Anywhere you go, you're not alone.
I thought of Cece's yearning to learn more about her birth family that summer. As I listened, my own yearning too, for ancestors whose histories have been lost. I thought of how excited I am whenever I meet an African person in Chicago and they claim me as their own. The woman in the Ethiopian bead store who giggled as we both struggled to get a string of amber over my very large head. And she said, "You must be Ethiopian. You have a head like ours." How happy that made me. As Russell sang the lines, in the cradle of the circle, all the ones who came before you, their strength is yours now. You're not alone. Kias and Giddens banjos plucking feather light, a cobweb subtle but strong, Makala's melancholy cello woven in between. Cece whispered, "It feels like they're singing to me." Oops, didn't mean to do that. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Francesca.
Hi, Amor. How are you?
I'm great. That was fantastic. It's great to be here with you. Um, and yeah, I think we're supposed to have a conversation now. So let's do that. But I wanted to first start by asking you a question based on what you were just saying. So you know, I'd said something about Nashville before, right? And of course, Nashville and country music, and you and Major actually did something on Nashville Public Radio, right? Together
Yeah.
about these books. So this is a nice addition to that. So I was, you know, I was lucky enough to go to the National Museum of African American Music the first week that it opened, just as we were coming out of the COVID lockdown. And after immersing yourself so much in this music and the history of Black presence and the erasure of, right? I mean, I remember, being on Broadway in Nashville, which is, one of the real centers of country music in the United States, and just marveling at this beautiful, beautiful museum, but also that it's smack dab in the middle of Country Music Row, right? And so I was just wondering, you were talking about the museum, the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. What is that like, based on what you've been doing? What does that mean to you to have that museum right there?
Yeah, I sadly haven't had a chance to go to the new museum. When I was in Nashville, I was lucky enough to get swept up by old family friends who showed me around. So I didn't get to actually go. But it means a lot because that presence of Music Row is there at the expense of the Black community. Like a lot of the building that happened in the city, from what I understand, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, included the raising of homes as well as businesses. So to have the music museum there, the Museum of African American Music there, I think is really profound. And I noticed that there's a new exhibit on Jefferson Street at the, I think it's actually at the Country Music Hall of Fame. And Jefferson Street is the corridor of Black business and music that was really foreshortened in the service of Music Row. But when I was there the last time, I was there for the Southern Festival of Books. And that was where I had the chance to meet Major, which was really wonderful. It really struck me how if I had still lived in Nashville, we moved there when I moved from there when I was 12, I wouldn't have been able to, or it would have been much harder to write an off-center history of country music because, or an offbeat, let's say, because the presence of that narrative of, and the whiteness of country music in its center, there would make it really difficult to kind of, I think more difficult to get my handle on my own contribution. I just think that so much has been erased, and there's that that ideology of whiteness is so strong there around country. Although I've met wonderful people who are really excited about the book and about Black artists, but that I never felt such a strong feeling of you know, closely patrolled whiteness that I felt in Nashville, and was kind of reminded a little bit of my childhood and some of those experiences that I forgot. Yeah, but that in a way that past of kind of living in Nashville was what brought me to this project, because I had been talking to my dad, who is a writer and teacher of English and teaches poetry. And he also plays congas and bongos. And I knew that in my early childhood, he had been playing as a sessions musician kind of in his spare time. So when I found out more about that and found out how really a lot of the musicians who invited him to play on their albums were country music artists, it made me think, oh my gosh, I really don't know very much about African-American connections and presence in country music. And what's more, it feels really weird to be interested in this. And it feels kind of disturbing and uncomfortable that I know a lot of those traditional country songs, like, yeah, Willie Nelson, I totally, it was at Moonlight in Vermont. Yeah, like I can recite to you whole K-Tel album spreads of country music songs. So, and then when I talked to great friends like Julie, for example, and others about their own relationships to country music, folks of the Black Diaspora, I really picked up on this shared sense of, yeah, kind of sometimes discomfort, not always shame, but sometimes fear around the fear of racial violence connected to the music. And I wanted to know more about that too. So that got me going on the book. And at the same time, there's been a real explosion of new Black artists in country music. So it was like, who do I not include in the book kind of became the bigger question. So what am I going to write about? So yeah, that was my journey of writing. And I would love to hear more about how you and Major came to this book together.
Oh, okay. Turning the tables. Yeah, so you know, when I was at the University of Vermont, they had I think English was the largest major there, and they had tried one of those things where they offer some early retirement packages, and more people took them than expected. So when I'd gotten there, the university and the department was really just trying to do a lot of hires to grow, and one of them was for a poet. And I remember, you know, when Major came to visit UVM and to do his job thing, just, you know, listening to his poetry and also thinking about my work and just certainly responding to it, and then bonding over, especially in his first book, Leaving Saturn, bonding over our shared love of like Sun Ra and De La Soul. Right. And right, two, especially in the first book, you see those two, the resonances of those two just running throughout the book. And so a few years later, I guess when I was here, I wrote one of the first critical essays on his work that was published in Melis. So, I had sort of been already immersing myself in what he was doing. And so we had sort of talked about our shared love and our shared engagement with music without doing things to sort of, I guess the word would be to participate in the music via imitation, right? But to think about the different ways that we absorb the music and then translate it however possible. And he has certainly done that throughout his work. And we shared, for instance, with jazz. We thought about, okay, we're thinking about what jazz teaches us about what can be done with space and time, right? And obviously there's more, but with hip hop, just even for so many of us, just being in some ways our first entrance into poetry, but also just thinking about and experiencing the idea of what could be done with words. And this is true for so many people who may not have ever thought to pick up a book of poetry and then move to a book of poetry. So that's the sort of background in terms of this. And he has been engaging with what poetry means, thinking about form and how he fits into poetic form, but also wants to, overflow those containers of form whenever necessary. And so these ideas of poetry, of art, of what that could be, of how one can develop, I think, I found really compelling in his prose. And I could trace it in his poetry, of course, as he had different experiences. You can't live in Vermont for 20 years and not think about nature in a particular way or experiences with nature. So so this is how we came together right, because this is the thing about living writers, is they're living and they have opinions, right? So you have to have a conversation, of course, and collaborate to see how we can articulate the development of one's art. All right. And so even in this book, in the last section, I had to convince him a little bit, but he was there with me, of course, to bring in some earlier things that he had written for the Source magazine in the mid 90s. So the Source magazine, the hip hop magazine. So he had a couple of articles. He had written liner notes for the Roots' second album, Do You Want More? And of course, this is also about Philadelphia at that time, which had so much young Black creative energy that has really hit it big. So many poets, so many musicians, visual artists have come out of that period in Philadelphia. So just bringing that all in and saying, okay, how do we understand the development of a poet's engagement with his own development? So I think that's that's really how I came to that, and just following along and trying to figure out how to wrestle it into a whole while trying to fight with the publisher about word count. But so yeah, and I think I think that's really where this kind of comes from. And I think your work also, last book and this book, is also, of course, dealing with certain kinds of development in Black creativity, right? And people might think, right, Black country music, just like Black formal poetry, right, is an oxymoron, or at least, to use to head to your words, an eccentricity. Right. So I did want to ask you about that, about the bridge, right? It's music, of course, right? But the bridge that you I guess, traveled on, right, between these two books, because I think in the end, this is also very much about what Black expressive creativity and the many forms it can take, and that it does take.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like the question I keep returning to, whether I'm writing about Shakespeare or, Fela, or writing about eccentrics like Grace Jones, or even Stevie Wonder and The Secret Life of Plants, or in this book, is how artists have been able to use, in some ways, the tools of popular music and commercial culture to create their own worlds, and sometimes through unexpected means, and to kind of challenge really essentialized notions of Blackness and to expand them. And then on the other hand, I'm always also really interested in how listeners use music and recognize in these artists blueprints for pushing boundaries and for creating new worlds. So, like, what folks call queer world making through music is kind of what I keep returning to. But I also, there's part of me that also likes to take on challenges and to really kind of get at um, or explore figures who are challenging to, and who wouldn't necessarily fit into the framework of queerness or eccentricity. So in Sounding Like a No-No, I wrote about Stevie Wonder, and initially it was challenging to fit him into my framework because Stevie Wonder's a genius. Like, no one would argue with the idea of the centrality of Stevie Wonder. And it was actually very hard to listen to him freshly in a way. I mean, his work is beautiful, and so it's always fresh and always renewing. But the icon of Stevie Wonder was so protected and so guarded, in part, I think, because of his blindness and maybe even his heterosexuality, that it was hard to kind of hear him in as an eccentric. And so I turned to that kooky album, The Journey to the Secret Life of Plants,
I love it.
as a way into really thinking about his own embodiment and his approach to art, and kind of what is limiting about the idea of the Black genius in some ways, even though I would say he is a genius. So in the country music book too, I found myself thinking about some characters who are really out there in terms of what they're, not characters, artists who are really out there in terms of how they're positioning themselves in contemporary country music culture. Like one of my favorites, Delilah Black, who really writes really powerfully political music and with a great punk sense of humor. But I also wanted to take on someone like Darius Rucker, who is in some ways like so normative in his centering and interest in courting the Black country, or just the country music industry, and to try to hear something that's vulnerable and also resilient and challenging. And it was actually kind of hard to do that, to kind of come up with a politicized reading that views him as an eccentric, but I did. And so I just kind of like to think about artistic agency and creativity, and the ways that music allows for the expansion of self, and to kind of use that as my guide. So that is where I kind of bridge the two books. But I will ask you, if I may, a little bit more about that process of collaboration with Major. And it was great to, hear about your friendship, and, I'm sure for him as a poet, to have a critic who really gets what he's doing and can write in a thoughtful way about his contributions was amazing. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about your process of collaboration and what that was like.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I appreciate that. And it just in terms of collaboration, I think it's really interesting because, and I would feel this way myself. I think if somebody, for instance, pulled out some papers that I wrote when I was, 24 or something, and wanted to send it back out in the world. So I had to really get a sense from him of how he understood his own vision and development, right? So we had to break it up, or I broke it up into 3 different sections. One on writings on poetry, the second writings on poets, and then the third is the sort of the influences and the early parts of his development. So collaborating was actually fairly low key, I think, partly because we do understand this work in similar ways, even if we've taken certainly very, very different directions in that respect. And so it was just a process of, it's almost like bringing someone through, and not in a psychoanalytic way, but right, bringing someone through their past, right, and trying to get at what was happening at that moment and how we can put these together. We didn't, I didn't want to do it chronologically because I don't think that development is linear.
Yeah.
Right. And I think also it's a little too easy, but it works for some things, but I just didn't get this, that sense. And even as Major talks about, the sort of the web of his influences and creativity and so forth. So the collaboration there was really, trying to get back to that moment and to see, of creation, of the writing, of conceptualizing these essays or reviews or liner notes or whatever, that moment of conceptualization, and then also being able to reconcile it with one's position in the current moment. Right. And I think so it was fruitful in that way, but it did certainly require conversations. It required me to certainly put aside, my own strong feelings sometimes about, well, I think, I don't know about this, I don't know about that. But so that was actually not a challenge, but that was a really interesting thing about working certainly with a living writer, someone who I knew a bit, and have worked with for some time. So yeah, I think that for me was, trying to reconstruct his archive in some ways, right? His development, how the music, for instance, the different musics hit him at the time, right? And it required really bringing someone back, or help, just talking it through, saying, okay, well, what was going on here? Where were you? How do you see this piece? And then pushing for my own vision as well, right? Without, while honoring his vision. Yeah, so that's and I think, again, it's like picking, like you were talking about, like who am I going to leave out? But first you start with, who am I going to write about?
Right.
Right. And then you hit these challenges like with Stevie Wonder that you were talking about. And it's a gorgeous album, right? Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants, but it is very, very odd. Right. And I say that in the best possible sense. And so just trying to, trying to really figure our way through the construction of these narratives, I think, is really useful. And I'm glad I had someone else to bounce things off of as well, while I was doing the work of sort of conceptualizing how this might go together in my own mind.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, I agree. After writing about Shakespeare, it's a joy to write about people who are alive. And I mean, Shakespeare had a choice too, but it just means something different. And to get feedback from artists, to recently I befriended one of the artists that I wrote about on Facebook, and just her. This is Delilah, who's not like a big superstar, and her excitement about being in a book is just really, really great and really fun to be able to like help amplify her voice, so to speak. And also, there's also that kind of nervousness too, like, am I going to get an angry letter, from someone, and that hasn't happened. But part of one of the reasons that I decided to use memoir together with musical analysis and historical analysis was to kind of put myself a little bit on the line too. And because I think when you are writing about living people, I just recognize the vulnerability of the people that I'm writing about and how they've risked something to make the music that they've made, and also to participate more or less willingly in a book. So I wanted to offer something else as well as my whole family. So I included them too.
So I mean, that what you said really makes me think about what you were saying about during your presentation about the banjo. And then that in turn made me think of a book that I teach often by Claude McKay, Banjo. And there is in that book as well an argument amongst this group of young men, right, who are living on the beach or around the beach, an argument about the banjo. Right, an argument about what the banjo signifies, if it's, if one should not play the banjo because it's, it's been used to demean Black people, and so by doing that, you're participating in that demeaning. But the main character, Banjo, right, has such a deep love for it, right? And I think that also comes out of that these folks are moving towards some kind of artistic expression that means something to them. And that might sound obvious, but it's a challenge to work through and to give yourself over that vulnerability to you, in terms of the artists that you're writing about, or me in terms of Major. I mean, I feel, grateful and honored to have been able to do this work, right? To be let in to someone's work, no matter what, other historical, cultural, pressures are out there. And that's kind of what I was hearing in you talking, right? Your presentation is also about engaging histories and personal histories and so forth.
Yeah, great. I think that really makes a lot of sense, and it's what I was hoping for too. And I just wanted to mention along those lines this amazing organization that I learned about in the process of my research called the Black Banjo Restoration Group, I think is what it's called. And it's basically like kidnapping banjos, sort of. Like part of it is about teaching Black young people and anyone who wants to know how to make their own banjos, with the eye to the ways that the banjo its history has been misrepresented, and how like this painful, really violent history surrounds it. So a lot of the apprenticeship and kind of passing along of the music and the sound to anyone who wants to know has been impeded by that. So part of it is this teacherly organization, and they have workshops, and Suli is a part of it and did a workshop with CPS this last summer, my banjo teacher, Suli. But they also buy up banjos that are by Black makers and try to get them in the hands of Black people, which I think is just really interesting. And, some might see that as a kind of literal approach to the history of appropriation. But I just think it's really interesting, and I admire the energy and just kind of the ingenuity of like researching these banjos and going online to find out, where they're being auctioned off or sold, and, using collective money to buy them and then give them to others. So anyway, it's interesting work coming out of Oakland.
Yeah, that sounds great. And so I mean, I'm not a poet. I admire poetry. I love poetry. I love writing about poetry, hearing it, reading it. But working with Major did not, or even reading it, did not make me think I should try poetry, because I think it was maybe too daunting for me, or I don't want to get into my own neuroses. But I found it interesting also that you were learning to play the banjo, I guess, before you started working on this book.
No, it was sort of as I was working on the book.
Okay.
But although I do take up instruments that I'm just like curious about. But yeah, it definitely coincided with the writing of the book because I've been working on the book for a while. But I
Did-
really wanted to, yeah, kind of think about the physical parts of the physical effect of hearing a music that in my ears, like Rhiannon Giddens talked about associating the banjo with Deliverance and the Beverly Hillbillies. Like that was kind of my association, even knowing kind of as a scholar that the history was deeper than that, but I still felt uncomfortable with it. And so I really wanted to just take that on and, playing the banjo, carrying it around, having it in my study, every once in a while playing for other people, but not very often. Like that's been a real education and a chance to just kind of think about how the haunting of the instrument and how there's a lot of tension around it. So I hope, like Cece has expressed a lot of curiosity about it. Um, and I don't know if that will last, but I don't know if she's in the room. But anyway, um, yeah, I want anyone to feel like, but especially thinking about her, thinking about Black young people, to not feel limited in terms of what the musical instruments are that have been a part of our history, and to feel free to create new things.
Yeah, and then like Major says, about Ella Fitzgerald and Willie Nelson's versions of Moonlight in Vermont, right? Just a glorious statement of freedom against constraints. And I think that's what I hear you saying. And so yeah, I had never really thought about learning the instrument and having that transform your approach to the work.
Yeah, I think so. I really do. Yeah, I just think it has given me more concrete ways to write about it, and also to just admire even music that I don't necessarily like, because I don't like all country music, let's face it, but to really admire the effort that it takes to produce those sounds. I don't think, I mean, yeah, I can't even wrap my head around it. So yeah, I think it's helped just to try and fail, to appreciate it. And I think you should write poetry more. So there you go.
I didn't say I didn't try.
Okay. So what do you think? Should we turn things over to Jennifer, or do you have more?
I think we can open it up. I always have more questions for you, but I think we can open it up if people have questions.
Okay.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, everyone. Hello. I want to thank Dr. Kohli and Dr. Royster for this amazing presentation. So we will open it up to the audience. We haven't had any Q&As submitted just yet, but feel free to kind of drop them in, and I will share with the authors.
Well, I would love to jump ahead since nobody has questions in the chat. Thank you so much.
Yes, please.
Totally enjoyed this conversation so much. And while we're waiting, can you please drop the links to the book in the chat? Because I'm sure after this conversation, some of us really want these books. My question, and I was debating how to ask it, so I'll ask it two ways maybe. Do you see your work as expanding Black cultural studies, Black studies, and how might your work be important to Black cultural studies in these times for both of you?
Francesca, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I do hope that this book can expand Black studies and Black cultural studies and be taught alongside lots of different texts, whether it's musical texts or literary texts or cultural studies kinds of things. Because I feel like what I hope it offers is another example among many of kind of the power of cultural erasure and our inheritance of the ways that Jim Crow has played itself out in terms of our entertainment and even our ideas about what we should like and love and our pleasures. And so that kind of theme just comes up over and over again with each artist that I'm thinking of, just the ways that those structures and barriers are there. But I also hope that everyone reads it. No, I hope it has a life outside of academia as well. And it's been nice to know that some musicians have read it or read some of it anyway. And some folks also have read it and are mad that they're not in it or more in it. So I've also I'm sorry, but yeah, I definitely do want it to be a text that yeah, like scholars and students can see and hear something of themselves and might open up stories and ways of listening to music.
So my book is obviously different in many ways. Whether it's I'm not sure if it's expanding, but I definitely think it is participating in a broader understanding of the influences and all of these sort of ideas and forms that that Black poets engage with, right? And that sometimes we think that they are that these are antagonistic towards each other, right? So, for instance, the fact that Sonia Sanchez is, and Lucille Clifton, for instance, or Rita Dove and Amiri Baraka, right? They're all incredibly important to Major's poetic development. But for a long time, right, the idea certainly was that, those two roads will never meet, right? That they are diametrically opposed. But what we see here, and I think we're still seeing it in this beautiful moment of sort of Black creative efflorescence, that we're seeing just how much all of this comes together for these artists and these writers, just in terms of their own influence and what they read and loved, and how they can actually also be quote unquote Black poets, right? Instead of thinking about, what one critic called the poetry of exhortation, right? Just sort of completely outward and speaking, quote, what we might think of as politically, right? There's also a space, and an important space, for Black interiority and Black intimacies to come out in this art. There's room for it. And I do think that this is what we are seeing as Black studies continues on, right? Just to sort of, that it also has taken its models, Black music as its models, right? That it is expansive and integrative, and it can work from many, many different perspectives. And I think that's what Major's work does. And Major says, I'm going this way, but I love all of this. And I think that makes it difficult sometimes for people who think about camps.
Thanks for that.
Thank you for the question.
There still isn't a question yet. Guess we'll just hold off a few moments.
So I'll ask a question of Francesca.
Okay.
While we're waiting, based on the people who are mad about not being in the book,
Yeah.
you don't have to name them. I get it. But can you talk a little bit more about how you made the specific choices of artists? All right, because there's an artist. Each chapter deals with one artist, correct, or a group or something.
Yeah, I can talk about that. They're the people I like. No, I'm just kidding. Let me see. In the introduction, I made kind of a historic narrative about Black artists kind of navigating the country music industry. And so I think that there in that intro, there's kind of a way that the mainstream country music industry and radio just has more, really in some ways takes up more space than I really wanted to, but is kind of a necessary evil in it. And so I wanted to choose artists for whom making a splash, except for the, the case of Rucker and Charlie Pride, who they're together in that chapter. Artists for whom country music as a genre is like a tool among other tools. And so, really, I chose artists who allowed me to kind of decenter that narrative of what country music is, or at least to take it on in some ways that are more explicit. And so even like Little Nas X, whose place in country music is kind of a big part of what I'm writing about and some of the controversy around him, he's also offering so much more than that. And so I really wanted to provide an argument against the genre and really to kind of challenge our listening ears for what is considered country. And I had just had this great conversation with Charlotte Amons and when I was in North Carolina. We were talking about Lemonade and Daddy Lessons. And by the end of that conversation, I heard all of Lemonade as country music potentially. And so it's like, you're right. Like once we take away like these like really silly criteria of what country music is, Black music, especially music that is centered in place, like Lemonade would absolutely fit the qualifications. So so I think I joked that I also chose people that I liked, and that's just true. Like I just can't get too excited. I once tried to write an essay on Eminem, and he knows this. Like I never was able to write it because this is controversial, but he just made me so mad. So I couldn't really throw myself into it. But there's always more, I think, though, to write about for sure. And okay. Are we still waiting for more questions? Because I have a question for more too.
We actually have a few questions.
All right. Yay. Okay.
Okay, so I'll ask the first question. It says, if you could both say more about how you dealt with the vulnerability of writing about real people, how did you talk yourselves off the ledge when things seemed too nerve-wracking?
Do you want to go first, Amor?
Sure. I mean, I think partly we could have those conversations, on the phone or on Zoom or in person, and not have to worry about having those kinds of conversations on the page, right? So I think that made things a lot easier for me, certainly. That I knew that I could call or just say, okay, let's hash this out. But yeah, it was definitely nerve-wracking to, because you want to make sure that the way that you're approaching the work coincides with the way that they're approaching the work. I do have to admit, I went in saying, I hope he likes this, with whatever I was writing or saying, because in the end, I recognized that I was a kind of, I was working with a legacy, right? And so not even, the alive part is one thing, but the legacy part is another. So I think for me, I think it's true with any writing, though, to be honest, that you just have to, jump in and see where it takes you, and hope that it hits, because sometimes it doesn't. And I do think that also that's part of the process that I had to get comfortable with, right? The idea of working with what we might consider failure, right? Or a failed moment, right? And to think about it as a moment, to say, okay, that moment is there, let's regroup and move on. So, but I mean, I only had one person. Francesca had a lot of people.
Well, yeah, it's really like talking myself off the ledge is totally true, because I tried to get at, I think often my guiding post is sometimes that if I'm really uncomfortable or kind of squirmy about something that I'm offering, then I think I'm on the right track. But that also means sometimes like, oh, am I writing something that if the artist that I'm writing about reads it, that they'll feel seen. And so I really wanted that. Like everyone that I wrote about is famous or kind of famous, somewhat famous, maybe a little famous. But I really wanted the kind of ethical commitment to, like honoring what I think they're trying to do with their art. And so I figure if that's like the guiding principle, and if I step on a few toes in the process or leave some people out, then I think it's okay. But also to maybe, yeah, I just try to, like I said, kind of also share the vulnerability a little bit. But I really, actually, I'm going to put this out there. Darius, if you're out there, he's the one who I really worry about. I really think that he's someone who, of all the artists who are alive, who's misseen and kind of underestimated in terms of the art that they're making. And I really, really would love it if Darius Rucker read that and said, someone finally got what I'm trying to do. And so that's kind of like my fantasy in my writing. And so I just kind of hold on to that. And also, some of the rules with memoir or other kinds of writing where you're writing about real people, whenever you can, sharing that writing with them, when it's at a polished stage, to make sure that you've got the facts right and that they're okay with, what's been said, or, okay enough with what's been said. So I also did that whenever I could. Not everybody has the time to sit and read, my chapter on banjos, but it's okay. But at least I made the effort. So
yeah, I love that. Yeah, I procrastinated a lot in sending certain things to Major, and because I just thought, I don't know, and then I said I'll do it tomorrow. So that's the other thing. But I wish you had gone first, Francesca. I could have borrowed some of what you said because it was lovely.
Thank you.
We have a couple more questions that seem a little, I guess, directed to Francesca. So the first one is, can you ask Francesca if she has made a playlist on Spotify or some other platform?
Yes, actually, okay. I didn't make it, but I was on a great podcast out of somewhere else in Illinois, maybe Central Illinois, Monty Mallon, and he made a podcast for me because I think I spoke out loud that I really wished I had one. So it's out there, and I think it's called Dr. Royster's playlist, which I wouldn't, country music playlist or something like that. I wouldn't call it that, but I'm just really glad that someone did that for me. And if you go to Spotify, and I think if you put my name in there, or if you put Black country music, something should come up. But it has, he not only chose music that I had mentioned in the book, but he also asked me if I wanted to add some more music, and then he added some music too. So it's a pretty nice playlist, and I'll find it and try to share it in one way or another, maybe on Instagram or something, or whatever.
Jennifer,
It looks
Jennifer?
like someone found it. Yes.
I know that you have a couple others, but this one seems to a bit go with that question. I got one from John Ziegler saying that I really enjoy listening to Linda Martell the other day. I believe she was the first Black woman to play at the Grand Ole Opry as a teenager. And so I would love to know more about her story.
Thank you, John. Yeah, she's, I just wrote a little piece about her song, A Bad Case of the Blues, but she's an amazing artist. And I talk about her in the introduction as someone who made one country music album, Color Me Country, and that had several hits, and she played the Grand Ole Opry, and she played Hee Haw and all these things. But she was someone who was under invested in by her label. And so she was with this label called Plantation Records, which is pretty awful. Her manager, or her, whoever it is, the execs for Plantation decided that they would take the budget to support her work and give it to the woman who sang Harper Valley PTA, who was also on their label. And they basically stopped promoting her and arranging for concerts and stuff. So she is, I believe she's still alive and is making music. I think she has a band, and she was pretty quiet about her retirement from country music for a long time, and just said that she had stopped playing because she wanted to spend time with her kids. But only recently, she really talked about being racially harassed, and this experience with her label. But she's inspired a lot of people, and Color Me Country um, is now the name of a really fantastic podcast by Rissy Palmer, who interviews Black, Brown, and Indigenous artists of color in country and roots music, every week, or maybe it's on Apple Music. It's really a great resource. And yeah, and so Martell, I think maybe she'll have a renaissance. I was actually going to propose, there's like this book series that I love that just focuses on one album called 33 and a Third. And I think she would be a great subject for it. But thank you so much for bringing her up, John. I think she's awesome.
We have one last question. I would like to know if our Native daughters have any indigenous roots to some of the tribes of the South.
Yeah, actually, Rhiannon Giddens is Indigenous, African American, and white. She's multiracial, and so yeah, and I don't know about the other folks, but I know that that's part of her heritage and identity. But she also, I think that I've heard them talk about that choice of Our Native Daughters as a title. I think it's actually from a poem, but I can't remember whose poem it was. But they're really interested in thinking about the importance and roots of Black men and women's labor in the United States, and just kind of the basic ways that every fabric of the U.S. is you can see kind of the roots and the work of Black people. And so I think they were interested in kind of thinking about Native, not so much as speaking to indigeneity in the ways that we think of it, although it's actually true that Giddens at least identifies as Indigenous, but also kind of just thinking about how foundational Black life has been. And so that's so they're thinking about it specifically in terms of African roots.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your responses, Dr. Royster and Dr. Kohli. There weren't any other questions submitted, so I think we're good to move on.
Yeah, and I think we're just about done, 5:28. Francesca, did you want to say any final thing to Amor, or because I know I think we did interrupt you when you were going to ask Amor a question.
Yeah, I can't remember the question now.
That's okay.
Yeah.
There's other times.
Okay.
Right. We'll see each other.
Yeah.
We will. But it's been great having a conversation with all of you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Anne to finish up for us.
Okay, first, thank you so much. It was great to listen to both of you, and also to listen to you talk together. Like it was really beautiful. So we're just going to announce a couple of upcoming events. So next Wednesday, February 1st, there's an event that's also co-organized between the Women's Center and the Center for Black Diaspora, called Black Trans Feminism is Literally for Everyone, with Professor Marquise Bay, who's a professor at Northwestern in the African American Studies program. Then on February 13th at 3 p.m., the History Department is presenting their Howard Q. Lindsay Black History Month lecture in person with Matthew Delmont, titled Half American, the epic story of Black Americans fighting World War II at home and abroad. And then on February 16th at 5 p.m., the Center for Black Diaspora is hosting a filmmaker talk with Dr. Lindsay Gary about her new film, Who Your People, a documentary film. So I hope you'll be able to join us for these different events and join us in community. I hope you'll join me right now in thanking Amor Kohli and Francesca Royster for this wonderful afternoon discussion. And we hope to see you next time.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone. Thanks again.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.